Savage sets a blistering pace in the first laps, tracked by the Mustang, Camaro, and Javelin.
Chrysler were famously late to the SCCA Trans Am party. By 1969, Ford, General Motors, and even little old American Motors Corp were all supporting factory Trans Am programs. And Chrysler were the only one of the big four still missing in action. But they finally arrived for the 1970 season. And then they promptly left at the end of that season. So it was all pretty fleeting. But their brief flirtation with the Trans Am left a lasting impression, and it also brought about two now highly desirable homologation specials. So Chrysler finally entered the Trans Am in 1970 as the last of the big four. And the program was pretty high profile, with two teams running two brands, and Chrysler even managed to poach Dan Gurney from Ford. But here's the thing. Chrysler wasn't actually entering the Trans Am as the last of the big four. In fact, they were returning. In fact, Chrysler was actually the first American manufacturer to commit to a Trans Am factory program way back in 1966. But the level of interest from the mothership was so lacking that many forget it ever even happened. Now, this was not actually a Chrysler directive. Rather, it was a small group of enthusiasts from within the company who pulled some strings and made some stuff happen. And they were doing it for love. It sure as hell wasn't for the money, because there wasn't very much of that. In fact, the parent company would have been hard-pressed to be less enthusiastic about the whole thing. So it all began with a guy from Chrysler Product Planning called Scott Harvey. The people at Chrysler called him Hot Scarvy because he was always excited about some new project. Anyway, he'd been rallying a Plymouth Barracuda, and when the Trans Am came along, he decided he wanted to get involved. So he convinced Chrysler to give him 3 Barracudas, and from this emerged Team Starfish. Now this was an official Chrysler factory Trans Am program, but there was very little money and just about everyone was working for free. And one of those was the brilliant young Chrysler engineer Bob Turozzi. Anyway, Team Starfish built 2 Barracuda race cars, and as well as Scott Harvey, Bruce Jennings and Charlie Rainville did most of the driving. Now they didn't actually manage to win a race outright, but at Breyer, one of their cars finished second to Alan Moffat's Lotus Cortina. So it scored maximum class points in that race because it was first in class. Now the crazy thing is, despite Chrysler's indifference to the whole thing, Plymouth almost won the 1966 Trans Am Manufacturers' Championship. With one race to go, Plymouth and Ford were actually tied on points. Now Ford hadn't actually run a factory Mustang in the 1966 Trans Am, but instructed Shelby American to prepare a car for the final race at Riverside. Jerry Titus was the driver and he won, and Ford won the Manufacturers' Championship. Now, Chrysler was also supporting a factory Dodge team in the 1966 Trans Am, which we'll get to in part 2. Now, had they put all their eggs in one basket, they'd have won, but the Plymouth and Dodge teams were busy taking points off each other. Now, you would think, having nearly won the inaugural Trans Am Championship, the important people at Chrysler might have got a bit enthusiastic about the project. But it didn't. They couldn't care less. They were more interested in NASCAR stock car racing and NHRA drag racing than they were in sports car racing. And to be fair, not too many people paid attention to the Trans Am in 1966. And then they withdrew what little support they had after just one season, and it wasn't until late 1969 that Chrysler finally announced their return. Now, the Chrysler announcement coincided with the release of their new E-body siblings, the Plymouth Barracuda and Dodge Challenger. And these were the first Chrysler standalone pony cars, and not tarted up multi-purpose volume sellers like the previous Barracuda and the Dart. Chrysler also produced a couple of homologation specials in the AAR Cuda and the Challenger TA. AAR, of course, is short for All American Racers, Dan Gurney's operation. Now this was a major coup for Chrysler because Gurney was like a rock star of the motor racing world. If you bought an AAR Cuda street car, you were now associated with Dan Gurney, and Everyone wanted to be associated with Dan Gurney. Now, the whole purpose of these homologation specials was to carry across special components to the race cars. In the case of the AAR Cuda, this included a fiberglass hood with a raised centre and a big knacker duct. And there was a rear spoiler attached to the deck lid. The AAR Cuda had a pair of winglets on the front corners, but these were purely ornamental. New Trans Am regs for 1970 allowed for non-factory front spoilers, provided they followed a strict set of guidelines, which I covered in part 2 of the story on the Boss Mustangs. Now, both the AAR Cuda and the Challenger TA street cars were fitted with a 340 cubic inch small block. In previous years, these wouldn't have been allowed in the Trans Am. You see, the SCCA had this bizarre rule in which production engines over 5,000 cc's couldn't actually be reduced in size to fit. So manufacturers were forced to produce special engines fitted to their homologation specials. That's what the Mustang Boss 302 and first gen Camaro Z28 were. But this was finally relaxed for 1970, and so both the Plymouth Cuda and Dodge Challenger race cars ran a de-stroked 340. Now, All American Racers did the initial fabrication work on both their Plymouth Cudas and the factory Dodge Challengers, which were run by Autodynamics. We'll get to the Challengers in part 2. And AAR ran all the shells through the acid dipping process. And these shells were all bodies in white, so they didn't have factory VIN numbers. AAR ultimately built 3 Plymouth Cuda race cars for Gurney and his young protege, Swede Savage. Because the shells had no factory VINs, the team made their own chassis numbers. And these were 5211, 5221 and 5231. Now, these were really trick cars. Remember, All American Racers also built Formula 1 and Indy cars. In fact, the AAR guys referred to the Trans Am program as the taxi cabs because they were used to working on proper race cars. And they had some really clever people working on the Cudas, including Bob Tarozzi and Phil Remington. Tarozzi became team manager. Remington had previously worked for Shelby American and before that for Lance Reventlow on the Scarab race cars. Now, the bodies were built on a chassis plate and the roll cages were designed by computer, so this was really cutting edge stuff. Bob Tarozzi was already working with computers when he was with Chrysler. Now, the Cudas were the first cars to fit a lug nut retaining system, and they also had a really neat fiberglass ventilation system attached to the A-pillar which fed cool air to the driver. Most other teams just had a piece of flexible pipe held in place with some gaffer tape. Now, weight was a problem for these cars, even with the new for 1970 minimum of 3,200 pounds. The E-body street cars weighed over 3,500 pounds, so a lot of work had to be done to kick the flab. Amazingly, over 130 pounds was shed from acid dipping the body shells, doors and other components. And you can imagine just how thin the metal was by the time they were done. And these cars were wide. They were about 5 inches wider than a 1970 Mustang and about 2 inches wider than a second-gen Camaro. So they were a fair-sized slab of metal. But they got the cars really low, aided by Chrysler's torsion bar front suspension system. AAR built their own motors, but used parts designed and built by the legendary Keith Black. And they had several engines at their disposal, ranging from about 450 to about 460 horsepower at 7,500 RPM. And these were backed by an A833 4-speed transmission from the NASCAR program. And at least one of these had an alloy casing to save weight. And this, of course, was illegal, so it was painted with cast iron spray to beat the SCCA magnet test. The rear end was a modified Chrysler 8 3/4 unit. There were over-axle traction bars, and partway through the season, a horizontal Coney shock setup was added to dampen the anti-tramp. Impressively, these cars also had fully floating rear hubs. This was virtually unheard of in sedan racing at the time. They were finished in Gurney's traditional dark metallic blue, and the magnesium mini lights had the centres painted white. They were just beautiful looking cars. Now, the team had 2 cars ready for the season opener at Laguna Seca. Gurney drove chassis 5211 with the number 48 on the door, and Savage drove chassis 5221 with the number 42. Now, Savage finished 4th on debut, but Gurney failed to finish either of the first 2 races. And then after round 2 at Lime Rock, the team was forced to switch to a single car operation after Chrysler slashed the budget. And with that, Gurney stepped aside and the team ran a single car for Savage. And interestingly, Savage drove Gurney's car in round 3 at Briar. He was back aboard his own car for round 4 at Mid-Ohio, but then drove Gurney's car, chassis 5211, from Bridgehampton onwards, but now as the number 42. Now, at several events the team took chassis 5221 along as a spare, and at Saint-Jovite, Savage drove this car in practice. And he crashed and rolled it into a ball, so that was the end of that car. Now, Savage could be a little wild, but man was he fast. In fact, he took pole position 3 times in 1970. The only driver to claim more pole positions was Parnelli Jones in the Bud Moore Mustang. But there were no race wins to be had. At Bridgehampton, Savage took pole and he smoked the field, and he was way out in front when he came in for his first scheduled stop. But the rear end failed when he bolted back out on the track to join the race. At Donnybrook, he also took pole and led the first half of the race, but then his gearbox stuck in second gear. Towards the end of the season, there was some hope that Chrysler might actually continue their support into 1971, but a race win was imperative. So Gurney rehired himself and chassis 5231 was prepped, and he drove this car in the last 2 races at Kent and Riverside. But in the end it made no difference. All-American races scored no race wins, and in fact Plymouth finished 5th in the Manufacturers' Championship from a total of 6 manufacturers. The Cudas were so fast, but they were also fragile. Savage only finished 5 of the 11 races with a best result of 2nd at Road America. Gurney started 4 races but only finished once, placing 5th at Riverside. Given the team were new to the Trans Am and the product that they were working with, it's amazing just how fast they managed to make these cars go. If they'd been given another season, they'd have been winners for sure. But at the end of the year, Chrysler pulled funding and their factory Trans Am program came to an end for a second time, and that was all she wrote. So, All-American Racers built 3 Cudas, and as we know, chassis 5221 was destroyed, so that left 2. And with the Chrysler factory Trans Am program coming to an end, both were sold off. Chassis 5211 was sold to Goodyear Tire. It was used for promotional duties and toured the country as part of a national program. And then in around 1976, it was sold to Sid Rust. He raced it in SCCA A sedan competition, and he was pretty competitive too. He contested the SCCA runoffs at least 3 times in 1977, 78 and in 1980. And he had to go through a pretty rigorous qualifying program just to make this event.
And on the right side of that front row is Sid Rust of Indianapolis, Indiana, driving a Plymouth Barracuda. Battle to turn number 1, and green flag is on. Rust on the outside. Lindley to the inside as they head for turn number 1. It's the Oklahoma land rush, so to speak.
In 1982, chassis 5211 was sold to Ed Skanes. He refurbished it and did a bit of vintage racing with it. He sold it to Harry Lippitz in 2003 and he kept it for 3 years before selling it to Andy Boone. Current owner Bill Okerlund has owned the Cuda since 2014 and he regularly runs it with the historic Trans Am group. And it's presented as the number 42 Swede Savage car. Chassis 5231 is the car that Dan Gurney drove in the last 2 races at Kent and Riverside. In fact, he announced his retirement from driving just before the Riverside race. So this was the car in which he drove his last professional race. So it had very little use when it was sold, and it was sold to Chrysler France. Now, that might sound a little bit crazy to you, but including the Gurney car, Chrysler France raced around 5 E-body Plymouth Barracudas between 1970 and 1973. While the others were mostly Group 1 based cars which were much more stock, most of them ran big block Hemis. They ran Cudas in local touring car races and in hill climbs. The legendary Henri Chemin oversaw the Chrysler France racing program and he drove chassis 5231 on several occasions. But even though the Gurney Cuda would have been super competitive, it was never actually raced in the European Touring Car Championship. which kind of makes you wonder why they actually bought it in the first place. It initially raced with the Trans Am 5-litre motor, but when this broke, a built 340 went in its place. And later on, a 426 cubic inch big block Hemi was installed. Anyway, in 1974 it was sold to Michel Guicher, and he fitted it with massive BBS wheels that looked to be 10 or 12 inches wide. In 1975, Guicher entered it in the Le Mans 24 Hours race. In pre-qualifying tests, it was apparently really fast on the long straights, but the car suffered from engine problems and it ultimately didn't qualify. Anyway, this car was still doing road racing, rallying and hill climbing work in France as late as 1977. Randy Peterson ultimately bought the Cuda out of France, shipped it back to the USA and restored it. And he kept it until 2005 when it was purchased by Craig Jackson of Barrett Jackson Auctions. He still owns it and runs it with the historic Trans Am group, and it's presented as the number 48 Dan Gurney car. Now, Bill Okerlund has amassed an incredible archive on these cars, including all of the original notes from Bob Tarozzi. And these notes are hugely detailed. Bob is kind of an unsung hero of this era, and he went on to enjoy a huge amount of success in various forms of racing. Now, it's obvious that the team was struggling from a general lack of support from Chrysler and from a lack of funding, but it's impressive just what they managed to achieve in such a short amount of time. Now, Bill Okerlund owns a few of these historic Trans Am cars, including a 1969 Penske Racing Camaro, 1970 Bud Moore Mustang Chassis 777, and the one and only 1971 Penske Racing Javelin. So he has first-hand experience of how these different cars compare. And according to Bill, the Chrysler motor has the most torque. The car also stops the best, and with the ultra-stiff chassis and the torsion bar suspension, the handling and turn-in is just amazing. So it's just such a shame that Chrysler pulled the pin and walked away before this team and these cars could really show what they were capable of. Anyway, we will switch across to the Dodge program for part 2, so be sure to tune in for that one. So that's it for part 1. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to tap that little bell thingy so you get a notification when I post up a new vid. Anyway, until next time, we will catch you then. See ya!
They're off, and Jones elbows through to dice with Savage through the first lap. Savage pushes the Barracuda faster. And still faster. Then a blown engine, and Savage takes a long, dejected walk home.